And I will welcome the first affirmative speaker to open the debate.
It's incredibly important to recognise that most people in this debate room have probably been told a lie about how carbon emissions work. You've probably thought of countries like Sweden as really, really good environmental actors. That is, they have very good climate bills of health, we are told, but that is because they are able to export all of their dirty work, all of the elements of their supply chains that are incredibly carbon intensive to the developing world. They're able to push them away from the guise of their national regulation, and they're able to exploit the fact that there are less regulations in certain countries, there are less protections against environmental damage, and exploit this to such a significant extent that we don't put any pressure on them to improve their act, to clean up the way that they all benefit from huge amounts of environmental degradation. On side affirmative, we were happy to stand against that. We're so proud to propose. A couple of pieces of context that I think it's really important to know. Firstly, we think that the EU leads kind of general regulation in a global context in a very unique way. This is because of the nature of this establishment of the EU and the way its parliament works. That is, because its parliament is above individual nations' interests, it's often able to do things that are perhaps more progressive than could occur on a home level. This is especially true because the parliament is uniquely resistant to lobbying in a way that smaller elections and smaller national parliaments are not necessarily. We think this is evidenced in things like the GDPR, which is world leading and has significantly influenced other countries' conceptions of how privacy regulation should occur. And now we think it is also true in the way the CBAM works. We think this is very important to consider in this debate. The second thing to remember in context is that when you roll back environmental protections, which side negative must stand for, it is almost impossible to reinstate them. To illustrate this, look at the way the carbon tax in Australia has worked. That is, when you implement a very industrially unpopular climate measure, you have had to overcome a huge amount of sentiment from those industries, from lobby groups, and that they have fear that is instilled in the general population of putting those policies in place. So when you reverse that, when you take them away, it is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to ever reinstate the support for environmental policies that allowed them in the first place. That is really important. Side negative can't have two bites of the apple if it turns out that this is actually a really bad way of dealing with the environment. The last thing to note is that the CBAM is places quite large levies on these products. That is, there is a significant amount of money that is introduced into the EU coffers, which we think is able to soften the blow when people do buy these products anyway, but also that it is significant, it is a large enough policy that it has a significant effect on the market. 3 points today. Firstly, why we incentivize the uptake of less carbon intensive products. Our mechanism here is quite simple. For most of the products given in the info slide, things like fertilizers, plastics, and cement, there is a very doable alternative that is much less bad for the environment. We would say things like plastic packaging, obviously, is actually relatively easy to replace, especially if you are now producing things on a domestic level. That is, you can now just use reusable packaging. There are less air miles on it. It becomes actually an economically feasible alternative. But also now we are obviously forcing the market to do this because they have no real economic alternative. And so we think they are likely to choose the alternative options available. But the second thing is, we think that the EU, the nature of manufacturing in the EU, and really big manufacturing giants that do still work, operate kind of domestically there, things like German car manufacturers, which are incredibly wealthy companies, have a lot of choice in how they source their material. That is, they are some of the biggest actors in the market. They have a huge amount of purchasing power, and so they are able to kind of put pressure on the people that they are buying from. We think that the result of these two things are that the alternatives that are more environmentally friendly become cheaper on our side in a way they simply cannot not on side negative. There are two impacts of this. Firstly, that now people in Europe consume more green materials. We think this is really important because it is like quite evidently true, we think, that consuming less of those is bad and more is good because of the impacts that it has on the environment. But the second thing is, like I pointed to in my context, the EU leads the way in regulation. Again, we think that countries often look to the way the EU has regulated things like their labour laws and the privacy laws that they have. Countries like Australia and New Zealand are watching them and following suit. We think this means that there is likely much more uptake of green options in the EU, but that also continues across the West. The second thing that we would say in this debate is that we incentivise innovation in less carbon intensive industries, which is incredibly important. Firstly, we change consumption patterns and like force consumption patterns to innovate because of the earlier mechanism. That is, when it is really expensive now to use either European produced carbon intensive things, which are obviously expensive because of things like labour laws, or to use imported alternatives, we think that companies obviously change. We think that this like stimulates the kind of spiraling decrease of demand that I've already told you about. That is, we think that once it's already become expensive and one company innovates a way, it is really easy for someone else to follow suit, and that there are probably economies of scale that emerge from that. But also, we think that now there is a significant amount of innovation in like decarbonising on the supply end. This is incredibly important in this debate because this allows the EU to exert their regulatory influence in a way that they absolutely could not if they were trying to, force a sovereign country to put laws. They're able to use the market in order to put this in place. Again, we would note that the EU is one of the largest consumptive markets in the world, and they have a huge amount of material influence over the places that they are importing from. We think this looks like two things. Firstly, now in countries that produce for the EU, you have a lower incentive to an incentive to lower the amount of carbon that you're emitting at a company level. That is, individual companies know that now they can be preferable if the CBAM doesn't apply to them because they have decarbonized. Obviously, very, very good thing for one company to do that because that flows on through the market. But also at a country level, if you would prefer that your developing nation is now, or your non-EU nation is now a preferable alternative for European customers, perhaps you put carbon regulations in place in your parliament in a way that otherwise you wouldn't have. We think that this greater innovation has compounding benefits. That is, the more that people that people try and do this first to have a first mover advantage, but then everyone flocks to doing it as well, so they're not left behind and left out. But the last thing is expanding on why we make green technology cheaper. We say that there are three reasons here, and that, again, this is something that needs to be weighed incredibly strongly in this debate, because green technology is one of the only ways that we can extricate ourselves from the very precarious environmental position that all of humanity is in. This is a pretty high stakes debate. So these three reasons. Firstly, again, we incentivize a change in investment patterns. People put their money in places where they think they're going to get a high return. And we think that if we see a massive increase in demand for green technology and for innovation, obviously investors are going to be supplying the liquidity that enables firms to do this kind of R&D, enables the scientific development that needs to occur in order for this to happen. The second thing is that we think that the demand for goods involved in production processes for things that are both carbon intensive and not carbon intensive goes down, which again lowers the cost of the non-carbon intensive process. That is, if there is a certain amount of intellectual property involved in creating fertilizers, which is relatively similar in some other non-carbon, is the same intellectual property used in other kind of industrial chemical reactions. Sorry, I'm not a science student. We think that there is probably a decrease in the demand for that. And so it is now cheaper to produce other things using that intellectual property, other greener technology in chemistry and things like that. That's incredibly important. But the last thing to say is that when there is more demand for green technology, obviously economies of scale begin to exist. And now the marginal cost of producing extra things when there is a huge demand for it obviously goes down. We think that's incredibly important because, again, we financially, economically incentivize people to choose greener technology, to opt out of the incredibly damaging situation that we are in with regards to the environment. So proud to propose.
Woo.
I thank first affirmative for their fine speech. I'd now like to welcome first negative speaker.
Could we just have a 1 minute? Sierra is just running back from the bathroom.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much. Apologies, side negative.
Do not apologize.
Sierra's just entered the room. Good to go. Sorry about that.
Thank you. No, all good. First negative whenever you're ready.
Hello, just checking you can hear me. Okay, sweet. I'm going to make 3 arguments in this speech. Firstly, I'll explain why this harms nations outside of the EU and that is the biggest harm in this debate, even if they get all their climate benefits. Secondly, I'll explain why this is actually bad for the environment. And thirdly, I'll explain why this harms people in the EU. Firstly, I want to make 2 notes of setup. The first note that I would make is just that there is obviously an opportunity cost to this policy, which is to say that in the absence of this policy, the fact that a lot of European nations want to do policy, like want to do this kind of climate policy, suggests that in the absence of this, they would do some other kind of climate policy, right? So obviously it's not a fair argument, but it just suggests that there is the will to do climate policy. In our world, they'll probably do it in a different way. We think that looks like things like expanding EU subsidies, or maybe governments are likely to just do things like directly incentivizing the kind of green investment that Liv talks about, particularly if she says that it's likely to be so profitable for these firms. We think they're likely to do some sort of policy similar to that anyway. But the second note I want to make in setup is just a contextual note to explain why firms are likely not to shift to less carbon intensive industries, but they are likely to just shift to internal carbon intensive industries. And there's 2 reasons to suggest that that is true. The first is that many nations in the EU do not have carbon taxes at all, right? Or where they do exist, they're super low. They charge literally like cents per ton. For example, like Germany, a huge part of this debate, has no carbon tax. Countries in Eastern Europe have small carbon taxes, but they're very, very low. That is just empirically true. But the structural reason why that's true is just that it raises the cost of living, so it's quite unpopular. That explains why this will make external goods far, far more expensive. So firms are likely to shift to buying these carbon intensive products internally because they're far, far cheaper. But second of all, and I guess the next note to make is just that, of course, you can get these products in the EU. It's just more expensive currently. That's why this policy works. That's the way in which I've explained this policy will work. But this suggests not that they will shift to less carbon intensive industries, but that's just that they will shift to internal carbon intensive industries. All of that explains why the shift is not as environmentally beneficial as the affirmative team says, but just that you shift it to internal firms. 3 arguments given that. First of all, why does it harm nations outside of the EU, knowing this is the biggest harm in this debate? The first thing to say is just the simple mechanism of this is just that it increases the cost of importing for the reasons I explained earlier, and also for the reasons the affirmative team explains. It increases the cost to import goods from overseas. That means you import them less. Note all the setup. For example, if you currently buy fertilizer from Mozambique, but now there's a tariff to import it, you are unlikely to import from there anymore. You're likely to just get it from an internal firm. That is particularly bad for 3 reasons. The first is that many of these countries that you would currently import from, but you wouldn't in the affirmative team's world, are structurally set up around exporting to the EU. There are huge numbers of firms structured around these kinds of exports. There are enormous numbers of workers employed in these industries. The second thing to say, though, is that these are typically poorer developing nations who don't have a wealthy consumer base, which means that they cannot sell that product internally. They rely on exporting it to the EU. So it's not just structurally they have set up their entire workforce and industry around exporting to the EU, but they cannot make the shift to exporting internally because they do not have a wealthy enough consumer base. But the third thing to say is that the EU is the world's largest trading bloc, which should suggest to you that this is likely to have an enormous impact on a huge amount of smaller developing countries who currently export these kinds of goods to the EU. And the important note that I make here is just that these countries are, for 2 important structural reasons, are likely to be far, far poorer than these countries in the EU. They're likely to be enormously dependent on these kinds of exports. First of all, reasons why they're poorer. First of all, these poorer developing countries have the cheapest labor forces, and particularly in the kinds of primary industries we're talking about, the EU tends to import from those kinds of countries that have cheap labor forces just because it's cheaper. But second of all, the EU is like countries in the EU are comparatively richer to a lot of other countries, which should just suggest to you on probability these are developing countries. The countries that they will be getting them from are far, far richer. What is the impact of that then? The impact of that is that you royally fuck over a number of countries in the developing world who currently export to the EU but cannot in the affirmative team's world. That has a huge impact on a lot of people's lived experiences. Now, people who are far poorer in the developing world cannot do things like feed their family. They cannot afford to live. They cannot afford to live in their houses. And the important thing that I note is just that these countries are very, very unlikely to be able to pivot in the way that this affirmative team sort of smoke and mirrors implies that they will be, for 2 reasons. First of all, these countries do not have access to the capital and technology that you would need to be able to restructure their industries and pivot. And second of all, are often exporting to a couple of other countries as well, which means they do not want to restructure because they want to be able to maintain economies of scale so that they can export a lot. That should suggest to you that a lot of countries in the developing world are fucked over by this policy. An enormous amount of people's lives are literally ruined when they cannot feed their families or afford to live in their homes anymore. That is a harm that this affirmative team needs to account for. Second argument then, this is terrible for the environment for a couple of reasons. The first is that for the reasons I explained earlier, EU firms simply just shift to domestic sources because, and I guess for the reasons that the affirmative team implies, demand for these products stays the same, but you just shift internally. So now you're doing the same amount of damage, it's just coming from a different place, right? Like you emit the same, you have the same level of emissions, it's just coming from a different place. And the note that I'd make is that this affirmative team implies that regulation in the EU is perfect. Obviously, it is not likely to be when they have to set up entirely new firms and entirely new industries. This gives the individual countries inside the EU an incentive to not regulate these industries because now they are more economically dependent on these kind of industries. The reason they can have such good labor laws now is because they're not dependent on these kind of industries because they outsource them. In the affirmative teams, while they are likely to walk back regulation, they are likely to weaken it, or I guess the other side of that is that they are unlikely to strengthen it. Now you are doing the same amount of environmental damage, but you're just doing it internally. But second of all, this is bad for the long-term climate policy. Things like domestic carbon taxes, things like the kind of incentives for green investment that I explained in setup. Now you have less capital to do that into the long term for a few reasons, and that is terrible. First of all, this policy that the affirmative team explains will be hugely unpopular. It will raise the cost of living for two reasons. Firstly, because putting tariffs on goods, like if you continue to import goods, putting tariffs on them makes them more expensive. That gets built into the price. But second of all, even if this does not directly impact the cost of living is super high, and people are not economically literate in a way to understand that this is not directly causing it. They are likely to perceive it to be the cause. That means that this is likely to be enormously unpopular already, and the capital to then do additional climate policy on top of that literally evaporates in this affirmative team's world. You cannot do things like carbon taxes. But second of all, businesses who literally exist because of this policy, right? So businesses that grow inside the European Union when people start getting carbon intensive products from inside the EU. Now you have created a huge amount of businesses who make up a large portion of your economy who now do not want carbon taxes. And they do not want carbon taxes. They do not want regulations good for the environment. And they're likely to lobby against those kinds of things. They literally make money from carbon intensive goods. Now these firms are likely to lobby governments to not do additional climate policy into the future. But also, and that is just for the reason that additional carbon taxes means they lose their competitive advantage, right? As I explained and set up, these new firms' competitive advantage is that their products are cheaper than the external ones. They want to maintain that advantage. That's why they lobby governments to not do things. These kinds of policies are more important than climate policies for the reason that the additional climate policy that governments would do on top of this, that they will not do in the affirmative team's world, impact everything, right? This team's policy impacts imports. This additional taxes would be on everything. That is far more persuasive. But I note two extra pieces of weighing. First of all, the trajectory of climate policy in the European Union, for the reasons that the affirmative team explains, is really good, but this affirmative team literally kills it. They fucking nuke all the political capital to do anymore. But second of all, even if they prove their policy is effective, we would say it is immoral. Firstly, for the reason that it so drastically fucks over the developing world for all the reasons I explained. But second of all, for the reason that, as Brendon will explain and will expand on in a second, this harms people inside the EU. This is because the cost of living goes up. Either they are paying the taxes, you pay this tax and it gets built into the price of goods, or you shift to necessarily less efficient domestic production, and that harms people as well. Prices go up, businesses that shut down, they lay off their workers. There is an enormous human cost to this policy. And even if the team gets perfect climate policy, we would not sacrifice current people's lives. Incredibly proud to negate.
All right, I thank first negative for their speech. I'd now like to welcome second affirmative.
Unfortunately for side negative, this wasn't a regrets debate. Otherwise, it may have been a successful strategy to wave your hands about and suggest that there was going to be some sort of magical, better policy that reduced the consumption of bad technologies that didn't also raise the price for consumers and incur all of the harms you want to stand behind on negative. Unfortunately, that wasn't the world we lived in. The world of the info slide and reality was one where the CBAM had been passed, the world in which it was too late to support it for the reasons Liv gives you at first that go unresponded to thus far. 3 questions in this speech. speech. Firstly, is it a good idea to support the CBAM in terms of environmental regulation and policy? Secondly, on the emissions of carbon and whether in the environment and whether it actually goes up with this domestic consumption. And thirdly, on externalities to the developing world. Okay, on this first issue about opportunity cost, I think that what Liv tells you quite clearly, but I'll extend on a little bit here, is that there is a massive regulatory hurdle to get any type of climate policy passed in the first instance. And I think that's something that side negative implicitly agrees. But the problem is, if you oppose the CBAM now, if you want it wound back, if you think that it's going to do something bad, that didn't pave the way for new things to exist, certainly not at an EU level, because you've demonstrated the failure of that strategy. You make it seem less viable to politicians and policymakers locally and elsewhere, but note as well the position of the EU as a unique forum for regulatory experimentation. I don't think that you get a second bite from the apple, and if that was what they suggested as one of their biggest benefits, they needed to prove it a lot more, and they had one more speech to do it in. But moving on to the real meat of this debate, two questions on the carbon and the environment, and then on the externalities that allegedly accrue to the developing world. Okay, on this idea about internal carbon emissions. So the first premise that I think they rely on to prove a lot of their material from first negative that goes unstated is that demand is inelastic for every type of thing that could be consumed. So you need to replace this with the locally produced thing, because it isn't possible that maybe say you could pivot from plastic bags to reusable bags, as a lot of jurisdictions have. It's not plausible that you're making a decision in the developing world right now from importing between something that is very carbon intensive and something that is a little bit less carbon intensive. I thought that those two examples just intuitively captured the lack of imagination that this negative team brings to the front when they fail to, when they hang their hat on the idea that it's all or nothing for fertilizer exporting countries like Mozambique. But they gave a few more pushes on this. The first one is that they said, well, I'm going to give a few more pushes against why you're not going to set up these internal industries. The first one is to say that I think in the same way that the developing world has sunk a lot of costs into industries, allegedly, so has the developed world, that they don't have things like manufacturing or factories or the ability to pivot their service-based economy into the production of things like cement. And that alternatively, even if they did, it was still going to be cheaper to import from the developing world because of something that once again side negative gestures to by implication, the labor laws that exist in places like the European Union, that meant that it was always going to be cheaper to do things like find an alternative, better source of import. And even if that weren't the case in the short term, why it was always going to be cheaper to do things like funnel and fund investment for those alternative sources, like Liv tells you about at first. I think that is well. I think that as well that once again, my next response beyond that is that the CBAM can also just operate a little bit more broad, and does operate a little bit more broadly than negative wants to suggest. It wasn't just that it was the tariff on fully realized products. It was also on the components of those products, components that often were minerals or materials and contributed to carbon emitting industries at the point at which they were put together in products in the European Union. And that type of thing was likely to remain static, regardless of where those things like resources could be sourced from around about the world, regardless of who had the pre-existing infrastructure, which is why you got a significant change there. But my final responses to this are just to say that even if you do get this local production in the way that they say, I think that that's still a big win for the environment for a couple of key reasons. The first is that you're going to have better regulatory standards in the EU for the pre-existing reasons why you the pre-existing standards that you have. And that doesn't just look like a unique benefit from side affirmative if they're correct in terms of labor regulation standards, but also looks like things like better green regulations locally that those countries keep and have to keep their green, clean bills of health and green, clean bills of health that are entrenched in the way that negative wants to suggest. But I'm going to extend beyond this and give you a few more reasons why I think that this is good for the environment. The third, distinct ones beyond resolving that clash that's emerged from the first two speakers' speeches. The first one is to suggest that I think that the propping up of environmental alternatives, even if they are too expensive in the short term, is the type of thing which provides a unique model, not just regulatory, but in terms of local innovation or inducing local incentive for systems and for products that can then be exported to the rest of the world once they become more sustainable or more cheap. For example, that looks like on a smaller scale, something like Germany testing out the FAND system for recycling and returning things and receiving a deposit, the way that was improved and made more successful over a couple of decades, and then exported around to the rest of the world because of the lack of cheap and dirty alternatives that negative wanted to gesture to by implication. The next unique reason that I'm going to bring you is that I think it's the case currently that companies in the West are the best capable and best suited to doing things like inducing innovation of the kind that both teams would like to see, but currently they are lazy and have no reason to. Often I think that these companies in the West are the same one that hoard patents and punch down on innovating companies in the West and in the developing world. I think you flip their incentive to do that and actually incentivize them to engage outside of their borders in terms of changing those supply chains and making them more sustainable. And in terms of the popularity push that we get from negative, a few things, like one, like not to be tautological, but it already has been passed to an extent. I think that domestic production is very popular if you somehow get it, but also it was unclear to me why this was the tipping point with how local people on the ground viewed the EU, which always skews lefty environmentally and over-regulatory regardless in both sides of the world. But next on this question of the developing world, a few responses to the push that they give you. The first one is just to say, omelets and eggs. The developing world and the people in it were also the ones who are going to suffer the greatest catastrophes and consequences of climate change, when rising sea levels inundated and flooded Bangladesh, causing refugee crises of millions, hundreds of millions of people. That was on the short-term horizon. I think that any change that you can get to reducing the climate increasing by 0.1 was going to be positive, especially when you considered the ability for us to export those things elsewhere, which is why that this was obviously the biggest issue for the developing world. But the next thing that I think that they say is like, oh, look, you can't get these things from the developing world because everyone's super specialized. But that just ignores that the developing world is like well over 100 countries. It wasn't just that Mozambique was producing fertilizer. A variety of these countries were producing fertilizer. I think that you incentivized countries in the West to choose the one that was doing it best for the climate, but also that you just would be able to pivot locally. They give you two reasons why you're not going to be able to pivot. They're like, you lack the technology and infrastructure. That's as deep as it goes on the first front. And then it's going to be cheaper to do it locally. I think that I can just cross assert that and you should buy it as being equally persuasive. But that extending beyond that, there's a massive first mover advantage for countries in the developing world and a massive incentive to do things like investing into it and pivoting. And if it is true that you were serving multiple countries outside of the EU, then the harm just simply wasn't as big as they wanted to put forward for their main win condition in this debate. Cheaper labor was still going to be cheap, as I alluded to in my first issue, which is why you continue importing. The pivoting argument that they gave was underproven. I thought that, like, just prima facie, you should believe that countries in the developing world can pivot from cross assertion, but we give you pretty good reasons why they can from first and second. Vote affirmative.
All right, I thank second affirmative for their fine speech. I'd now like to welcome second negative to continue their team's case.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Awesome. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's be very clear. The burden of the negative team is not to show that repealing this policy will be a good idea. By opposing this motion, we are simply saying that the world without this policy is better, which means that the affirmative team's frame of it's very difficult to have two bites at the apple, in effect, is an argument for our side. Because what it demonstrates is that they had to demonstrate unique benefits of this policy, whereas we explained that the scope of this policy was limited and in fact eroded political capital for better and more expansionary climate change policy down the future. And that is the reason why the negative team is firmly winning this debate. I'll start on the issue of the environment, simply because it's the sole path to victory for the affirmative team. So if you do not believe they have a win on the environment, you believe that they lose on that metric. And the first observation I want to make from the top is that they don't reduce the amount of carbon intensive goods produced on net. They just shift where these goods are produced. And that was because the demand for steel and fossil fuel remained fixed. What are the responses that we hear from the affirmative team? I'll start with the more recent one, which is from second affirmative, which is that the sunk cost in developing nations means that you will still mine from developing nations. The first thing to say is that it is they already explain why this argument is not credible, insofar as they explain that these developing nations can easily pivot away. Is the precise reason to explain why firms didn't go to EU instead, because it is costly. If you believe that they can pivot away, you believe that these sunk cost is not substantial. But we would give a few other independent responses. Firstly, we would note that many of these domestic firms within the EU already exist to some extent, and what this policy does is give them an undue competitive advantage by increasing their revenue. But secondly, they never weigh the sunk cost of this, of really changing your supply chain structure towards the additional cost of this tariff. And we would say that many of these industries operate on very low profit margins because they are industries that have lasted for a very long time, which meant that every actor on the supply chain has changed their cost structure such that it is so efficient that they cannot even support a 2% reduction in their profits, which means that to the extent that you dampen the amount of profit you get, the next best alternative is these firms to move elsewhere and move into the EU where these tariffs will not require. Which means that at the end of this, the burden of proof for the negative team is extraordinarily low. You just have to believe that the EU already has areas within its vast scope of region that have these natural resources, and firms will simply go there instead because it's far easier to extract. That's why the first response from the second affirmative does not fall. The second and more implicit response is that there exists environmentally friendly alternatives that people will buy instead. Three responses. Firstly, we would say that just an insufficient number of these goods that currently exist for this alternative to be credible. And the way we know this is that the global leaders in renewable energies are in fact European nations, like the Netherlands for wind energy, like Switzerland for hydroelectricity, and yet they import anyway, which suggests that these alternatives cannot be substantial enough for that to be the case. But what are the structural reasons for this? We say that when it comes to things like energy, the problem with, for instance, solar energy is insufficient technology to store this energy and for that capacity to exist. And secondly, when it comes to other goods like steel, the problem is that the costs of synthesis are either more expensive than just mining the steel or just, in fact, rely upon goods that are worse for the environment, which is why we have not seen a remarkable uptake of these renewable goods. It's because they are not sufficient in the market to begin with. But lastly, they in fact concede this argument to the extent that they had the intuition to run an argument on innovation, which means that even if you believe that argument on innovation, that just proves that these goods will exist in the long term, but in the short term, firms will certainly enter the EU to extract steel and natural gas. And the problem is that the entry of these firms or the strengthening of firms already within the EU gives them greater leverage to exert political capture to ensure that further policies down the line that affect their bottom line will not be passed. Let's kind of deal more substantially to the next argument, which is that this encourages innovation. The first thing to say is that this is not mutually exclusive. And you know this because all of their reasons to explain, for instance, that there is a first mover advantage is not at all inherent to this policy. And in fact, obviously, there are a series of other pro-climate change policies that we could support, like, for instance, subsidizing innovation directly, which means that their benefits here are symmetric, whereas we point to a unique harm of screwing over developing nations, which I'll talk about later, and that is uniquely bad for a number of reasons. But let's deal with their only other unique benefit to this policy, which is that we don't mind the transfer from firms from the developing world to the EU because the EU simply has better regulation. I have a series of responses. Firstly, they don't explain why better regulation in effect is better. Like, they don't explain how it lowers emission, for instance. We would point out that the vast majority of the problem is that the carbon release is inherent to the good itself. So any kind of effect of regulation is quite marginal. But secondly, we explained that regulation gets worse for a series of reasons at first negative that don't get any response. The fact that firms now will exert a downwards pressure on regulation because obviously regulation will hamper their profit margins. And in fact, the reason why the EU has good regulations now is because they can afford to, because they don't rely upon those exports. So to the extent you have to make voters and firms choose between good, sensible environmental policy that also dampens their profitability, we know that most people will opt for profitability instead, which means that there is a political pressure on those regulations to go away. But lastly, we would say that even if there is some regulation, in effect, those regulations do not matter, because if you believe that there is a transfer of a supply from, South America, you can't really mine oil from there anymore, and instead you go to the EU. What that means then is that the firms in the EU have to extract oil at greater than normal production rates. And that, in effect, is bad for the environment. Over extraction is far worse because you're far more likely to go into more areas that erode trees and things like that. You're far more likely to pollute waters because the cost of over extraction are exacerbated by the very cost structures that this affirmative team implements. So even if it's regulation, that doesn't matter because what firms effectively have to do is bad for the environment. So given that that's out of the way, what are the two unique harms that we point to, which they never really sufficiently respond to? The first is that this creates industries that exert corporate capture to prevent domestic carbon tax from being passed. And their only implicit response to this is from first, to suggest to you that the unique structure of the EU makes corporate capture difficult. Again, we give a series of responses to this. Firstly, it is not clear which feature of the EU Parliament makes this argument true. In fact, we would say that the unique features of the EU, in fact, make corporate capture far easier for a number of reasons. Firstly, because the EU's priority on consensus building means that all corporations have to do is exert pressure on one nation and to have them change that one vote, which blocks reform into the first place, because it is often done on a consensus basis. Secondly, we would just point out that the fact that there is so many nations that make up the EU means that it's very harder to screen against things like corruption, because the lens of accountability is divided across so many different actors, which makes it far less scrutable. Lastly, we would say that even if this argument is true, it doesn't matter when EU nations will not enforce it in effect. And given that they no longer have the incentive to do this because it hurts their own bottom line and hurts their companies, they will not adhere to policies. And given that the EU is so reticent to punish countries for doing this because they have fear that these countries leave the EU, that suggests that their policies are essentially toothless. But even if you don't believe that this political argument capture stands, we gave a separate mechanistic pathway as to why this erodes the political will for innovations, for climate change policy. And that is simply that you raise the cost of living, which the affirmative team do not really sufficiently engage with. Their only response is, well, that would be true of many different kinds of climate change policies, which simply is not true. For instance, just plain subsidies of innovations obviously doesn't lead to this. If anything, it leads to a reduction in cost. Or things like emission trading schemes obviously doesn't levy the cost of that on the consumer. It levies the cost on that to the firm, and that therefore they have an incentive to realign their cost structures to minimize that. So all those things, however, are mutually exclusive to the negative bench insofar as you believe that they are less likely to happen because people do not vote for it. And notably, even if you don't believe that this precisely raises the cost of living, the cost of living crisis is already happening anyway. What the right will do is simply blame this policy as responsible for that trend that is already happening, which means that all the harms of that still carry. At the end of that, this affirmative team has not shown a unique benefit of their climate change policy. We have shown a series of unique harms, and that is why we win this debate.
I thank second negative for their fine speech. I'd now like to welcome the third affirmative to conclude their substantive case.
I think that team negative in this debate gets strangled somewhere between the harms they try to prove and the benefits they try to ground. Because it cannot be simultaneously true that you have huge amounts of right-wing populism brewing because you are making everyone poor by virtue of the cost of living crisis, and also be true that the demand for this is so inelastic that you just transfer all of the production internally such that you literally do not lose out on any production. I think it's probably true in this debate, and this is the realistic conception that we give you all down the bench that you should probably just credit more, which is that maybe, yes, some firms and some production gets moved internally. But because you change the profitability of the worst types of emission intensive industries, you make it such that renewable industries are more viable. Because of the uniquely long-termist investment patterns for things that are known to be going to be profitable in the future, you allow for the transition of capital, of investment, of all of that like goodwill to patents and to product that are far better for the environment. You allow that uniquely under our side of the house because you realign the margins of profit. You make it such that you internalize the cost of environmentally destructive practices. That is why we win this debate simply. 3 issues in this speech. Firstly, on the environment. Secondly, on the pricing of goods. And thirdly, on like political sentiments and what happens with regards to right-wing sentiments. On that first point about the environment, what do they try to tell you? They tell you that you cannot pivot because they don't have the technological and capital and capacity to actually do that. We already give you the response at second, which is to say that you can simply like actually invest in those things, but a couple of additional responses here. The first is to say that we think you just change the willingness to invest because oftentimes investors predicate their decisions based on regulation. This is a hugely motivating factor for them. Even if in like the short term this isn't good, they tell you we get huge long-term benefits. The second thing to say is that this is just like important to be comparative in this debate, right? And this is quite crucial for like cutting a lot of their benefits, which is to say that they tell you that you get the immense and sudden relocation of all of these like extractive and energy intensive industries into domestic places. It was unclear as to how you had the capital for investors to move all of these firms, to move all of that production internally, but you didn't have the capacity to like switch out particular ingredients that you were using in the supply chain that made them really environmentally problematic. They failed to reconcile that at any point. They cannot do that at third. The third thing to say is that oftentimes these countries existing in the developing world actually had their own internal domestic incentives to make their like production more renewable. That was because they were uniquely susceptible to the implications of climate change. That was because a lot of loan conditionality was increasingly being tied to things like how environmentally sustainable are you, because we had new long-term outlooks that meant that they had internal incentives to pivot as well. What else do they tell you on the environment? They tell you that now you have a walking back of regulation because like these companies become more like, or the countries in the EU become more dependent on these industries, such that they have a decreased capacity to actually like regulate them. A couple of responses here. Firstly, we tell you that it's actually more likely at the point at which you can no longer insulate yourselves from the environmentally destructive implications of their practices, you're more inclined to regulate them. That is to say, when the dumping of toxic waste is happening in the EU, as opposed to some like town in a rural area of a part of the world that you do not care about, you are more likely to actually and actively regulate them. But secondly, we told you that the democratic mechanisms that exist within countries in the EU are just stronger, which is to say that when someone dies because of toxic waste dumping in a country that is democratic, they have an increased capacity to actually change that by virtue of that democracy. But the fourth thing to say here about like why regulation isn't impacted too much, right? They try to tell you that a couple of just additional reasons that's why we get better regulation. Firstly, because if they try to tell you that like the demand for these goods is so like inelastic that all of it just gets moved into like domestically in the EU, that probably means that they have an increased capacity to actually regulate them. If something is happening in your country, you probably just can like leverage all of the fact that you like literally control the country to make it such that they have to comply with you more. But secondly, we tell you that you get increased like transparency anyway, which is to say that you don't have to rely on third world like meteorological or like monitoring systems, which can oftentimes be susceptible to lobbying. You can just see what's actually happening. You can have a better capacity to actually enforce regulation. What else do they try to tell you on environment though? They tell you that the EU is a bad place to do this because you only need to like political capture gets worse there because you only need to take over one individual in order to break consensus. Obviously, it wasn't the case that in every single circumstance the EU was like impeded by needing to build consensus. They would never pass immigration policy. They would like just never pass anything ever if that was actually what happened in the real world. Don't let them lie to you on that point. At the end of the environment issue in this debate, I think you should probably believe that yes, maybe some companies move to the EU, but for the vast majority of companies that are currently benefiting from an outsized profit margin that was a failure to internalize the direct cost of climate change, you decrease their profitability. If you're willing to believe that there exist alternatives for renewables, alternatives that are presently viable, like green technology, like manufacturing processes that aren't toxic because they're not the cheapest, but they're just not like as bad, then you increase the incentive to invest, to buy those particular products. You get huge environmental impacts for us in this debate. That was a winning point. Secondly, on the cost of goods and the cost of living crisis, what do we tell you in this? The first response here to say to that was like, oftentimes these goods are artificially cheap, and that was a direct like implication of them not internalizing the cost of climate change. It was expensive to protect yourself against climate change. It was expensive to rectify later. We don't see why it was a good thing for things to be artificially cheap in the short term if it meant to environmental destruction in the long term, oftentimes for the most vulnerable individuals. But secondly, we told you that if it was true that you increase domestic production to such an extent that like everything now gets produced in the EU, and this was a specific point that they needed to reconcile in their debate, in their case that like absolutely lost them this debate, it was probably true that you substantially increased the material conditions of people living domestically, right? If it was true that all of the manufacturing and all of the production happens in the EU, then obviously wages for people living in the EU goes up substantially. Cost of living crisis is substantially mitigated by the proportional increase in wages there. But then it's important to ask yourself, with all of their analysis about the political sentiments, whether or not that actually tracks on to this debate. Because what we tell you quite clearly was it was damaging to continue practicing and continue buying in ways that were not sustainable. It was damaging to do this in a way that would eventually have to crash at some point. I think the question then of whether or not a more sustainable transitioning out of this, as opposed to a volatile sudden drop out of it, which is more likely to engender the types of like right-wing grievance and sentiments that they say are bad in this debate. It is likely that happens under your side of the house when you have a sharp shock, as opposed to under our side of the house where we can do this and phase in more renewable alternatives. We do not believe that it is true that if you buy the characterization that everything moves to the EU, that you substantially lose out on like the cost of living crisis because you obviously increase wages in a way that's proportional. But what else do they tell you about what else do we tell you in this debate we just don't think gets substantially responded to under this point? We tell you we have a huge amount of sheer capital to merely just reinvest in renewable technologies. That was a direct impact of doing this levy. This is a huge debate-winning argument that just needs to be credited and wasn't engaged with enough. That is money to invest in firms. That is money to invest in like the type of battery storage technology that makes things renewable, that makes things easier to be purchased and accessible. That was all of that capital that we could do in this debate. That was a net impact that we won on that fair and square. Next in this debate though, what do they tell you about like the tenability of actually moving towards more environmentally sustainable alternatives? They tell you that like all of these companies move away and you don't have the ability to like move up as like a Zimbabwe or an other country because you don't have the capital to do that. I already responded to this substantially, but I just want to go back to like actually what we told you and the viability and the tenability of these things, because it wasn't always just like a huge restructuring. Sometimes the reason for soy was environmentally destructive was the use of one particular material and ingredient that was so toxic but was just cheaper. We tell you that under our side of the house, if you believe that in some cases you would phase this out for things that are more sustainable, like packaging with paper as opposed to packaging with plastic, using less toxic raw materials, we win this debate and we win that argument about being able to phase it out in a way that is good. Okay, lastly on just weighing and what we think we prioritize in this debate and why we think we win by a considerable margin. Firstly, because we were able to tell you why we aligned the environmental incentives in a way that was good, in a way that was long-term, in a way that was sustainable. But secondly, even if you believe all of their analysis about things moving domestically into the EU, you should believe that that should be done better in a regulatory manner. You believe that you internalize the cost to the most determinate decision makers in a way that decreases their incentive to practice in that way. If you believe that there exists some viable renewable alternatives, if you believe that there existed a capacity to just not use the most toxic material, then you believe that we change the incentive to do those things. You believe that we win on the environment and on the cost of living crisis. So proud to propose.
I thank third affirmative for their fine speech. I'd now like to welcome third negative to conclude the substantive portion of this debate.
Hey, can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
I'm sorry, just it's all right. I might take a minute to organize my paper. Just sorry. All right. I think I got it. Going to start my speech. I'm pretty sure I checked if I was audible. I'm sure someone will tell me if I'm not.
You are.
Sorry, I think I've already asked that, but I have forgotten. I'm doing way too many debates now. 3 questions. First, on how this affects countries within the EU. Second, on how this affects countries outside of the EU. And third, on the environment. Let's start with countries within the EU. This is incredibly simple for the reason that they never properly respond. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but it is incredibly important. What do we explain to you? We explain to you that this is incredibly likely to be bad for countries within the EU because the cost of goods will go up first because they have to pay the tax. Second, because you have to shift to less efficient domestic production, which is necessarily less efficient, or they already would have been doing it. Third, we explain it hurts their exports for the reasons that you're more likely to get other countries in the world
putting in sets of retaliatory tariffs so EU countries are unable to export. We explained that the economic harm to countries within the EU is distinct to things like subsidies, which do not raise the cost of living. That means that businesses have to shut down. That means that people lose their jobs. That means that economies contract, and that affects the poorest people most, the people who lose their jobs, because wealthy people can insulate themselves from their impacts, but the poorest people can't. That is an enormous impact on the poorest people in the debate. We received two responses. First, they say it's good for the EU because they'll get new jobs. Yeah, a small amount of people get new jobs, but an enormous amount of people lose their jobs because input costs are higher, or because they can't export anymore, or even if they still have their jobs, the cost of living is more expensive, so they cannot afford things like electricity. The next thing they say is, it's not a good thing if it's cheaper, if it's artificial. Like, I don't know what artificial or natural prices are, but I don't care whether the prices are artificial or natural. I care that the cost of energy is cheap, so people can afford to heat their homes and do not freeze to death in their homes as they did under Thatcherism when we did not deflate the prices. The fact that this is artificial does not mean that people being able to afford energy is a harm. So that issue is over. And the fact that they barely responded to it doesn't make it important. I'm going to explain why the environment is less important anyway, but that is already an enormous win because we explain why it is that you make life worse for people. I'm going to weigh that later. Next question, how does this harm nations outside the EU? We explain that this fucks over nations outside the EU who are selling things to the EU because they're going to import less from them for the reason that these countries now it's just more expensive to import from them. And we explain, first of all, these countries are often structurally set up to import from the EU. We second explain they often don't have wealthy enough domestic consumer bases to be able to replace EU buying. And third, that the EU is an enormous trading bloc, as the affirmative team also concedes. So the impact on these nations is enormous. They cannot export their goods anymore. That is economic Armageddon for this team. We next explain why it is that they're unable to pivot. We explain that they often don't have access to the levels of capital and technology. They counter assert that, oh no, they do just have the levels of capital or technology. Obviously, these are both assertions, but the more intuitive assertion is the one that developing countries have less money and less access to capital. Clearly a more true assertion. But the second reason we explain why it is that they're unable to pivot to better things is for the reason that economies of scale mean you often want to do your domestic production and all of your production in the same way. And when you're having to make things domestically and you're having to export things to non-EU markets, you want to do all of them in the same way. So they're not going to change all of their production to be the more expensive version that the EU requires. And therefore, they're simply likely to continue producing most of it in the way that is currently cheaper. So how do they respond? They first say it'll always be cheaper to do it in developing countries because of labor laws. But obviously, labor laws reduce the cost. And then when you increase the cost, you mean it might not be cheaper, particularly when you have to combine it with things like the transport costs. Often it is like only marginally cheaper to import it from countries outside the EU. So this tax, which for them to get any of their efficacy must necessarily be large, will mean that you will no longer be importing from countries outside the EU. And secondly, the thing I want to note about this argument is that their benefits literally rely on it true that you pivot from outside the EU to inside the EU. So you cannot believe at the end of this debate they won't pivot from outside the EU to inside the EU because they make a series of arguments about why the EU has better regulation and that is good. So plainly they are going to pivot. The next thing they say is, but the EU wouldn't be able to produce these things because they don't currently have the industries. First, this relies on the absurd premise that there are no carbon inefficient industries in the countries. Like the EU, as we point out, is very diverse. Clearly, there are some industries that can make steel. And secondly, even if you didn't currently have them, you can start new industries. That's a thing that can exist. Their next claim is, margins are so large that they're just going to it'll just eat into their profit margins. What I would explain is that commodities industries in particular are highly efficient because they're traded so much. That means that profit margins are structurally very small. So it's incredibly unlikely that's true. But even if margins are large, that doesn't mean you couldn't, optimize your margins by being in the EU. So we prove, and they actually concede, that this means you would no longer be importing from outside the EU, which we explain is incredible harm to the poorest stakeholders in the world, because they are just like tend to be developing countries, as this team concedes for a lot of their analysis. You mean that they lose their jobs. You mean that people might die because they cannot afford the goods and services that they need to live. A massive intuitive harm. We are so far ahead on the economy, both within these nations, but crucially for the most vulnerable stakeholders in this debate, that means that they cannot outweigh it on the environment. But let's now turn to the issue of the environment. The first thing that I want to do on the issue in the environment is just to explain why, even if you believe that they win it, it is less important than the issue of the economy. First, this is because the trajectory on climate change globally is already quite good, so it's unlikely to be the enormous harms that they say. Second, even if we could solve climate change in this way, we would say it would be a principally enormously unjust way of doing it to solve climate change by fucking over the poorest, most vulnerable stakeholders. Third, we would say that theirs is a future speculative harm, and whereas ours is a certain harm today, and that we have more of a duty to the people who will literally die from this. Fourth, I would say when they claim that climate change is an existential harm, this is an existential harm as well. To the people in the developing world who lose their jobs, who cannot afford heating oil, who cannot afford food to feed their families, but our existential harm is certain. So we're the only team in this debate that does actual weighing to explain why our issue is more important than theirs. So even if you believe that they take the environment, we win the debate anyway on economics. But let's explain why they don't take the issue of the environment. We explain that this is worse for any other kinds of long-run climate change policy. And they legitimately explain this to you as well when they say you can't have a second bite at the cherry. So that means that you can't get long-term climate change policy. We explain that this is likely to be unpopular because it will increase the cost of living, or at least be blamed for the increase in the cost of living. It's happening for other reasons. And secondly, we explain that there's a set of businesses now that will exist in the EU only because of the competitive advantage that they get from the different levels of carbon pricing, and they will then lobby not to have internal carbon taxes. So the kind of carbon policy that they get is less important than the kind of carbon policy that they stop from happening in the future, for the reason that general carbon taxes influence everyone, and that means that is actually a far larger environmental effect. So they lose the issue of the economy because it is that they foreclose worse forms of economic change. But why do they say that they actually benefit the economy? They say, you're going to incentivize investment in things in green energy because it's now less expensive. First, we explain we can get other things to do this, for instance, subsidies with the political capital. But second, and this is how we flip this incentive and win on the environment even here, is that you actually reduce that incentive, because under the status quo, the EU really cannot be competitive on fossil fuels. So all the large amounts of domestic EU capital have to go into green energy because that's the only area where they have a comparative advantage. Now you give them a comparative advantage in fossil fuels. So there's going to be more investment into fossil fuels from domestic capital. So they actually get less investment. They next say, they're just going to do things that don't harm the environment, right? But like cement and iron and steel and fertilizers do not have alternatives that don't harm the environment. And if there were easy alternatives that don't harm the environment, these things are likely to be banned or phased out anyway. So this debate is necessarily about things that don't have super easy alternatives. Their next claim is demand is just super elastic for these things. First, no, people need food, which means they need fertilizer. They need homes to live in. Demand isn't super elastic. But even if demand was super elastic, that's just a concession that their mechanism for getting change is that they make people poorer, and therefore they buy less things that require it. The final thing that they say is it's better if it's within the EU because you have better regulations. This is just an enormous intuition push that the EU has better regulations. But I would point out that, as they say, if Bangladesh was really affected by climate change, they probably also have really good regulations. The EU doesn't always have great regulations. Even if they did, it's a marginal issue.
I thank the third negative speaker. I would now like to welcome the negative reply speaker when they are ready.
Cool. Problem with this affirmative team is very simple. All their arguments are reasons for a carbon tax in general, but they only supported a carbon tax on imports. And that had two key strategic implications for their case. Firstly, it limited the scope of their benefits because their incentives only applied to importers and not all producers. But secondly, and far more importantly, it reduced much of their case to being symmetric benefits because other policies could also achieve the same effect, like on innovation, a direct subsidy. And that meant that the burden of proof on both teams in this debate was asymmetric. Firstly, on the environment, we didn't have to prove that we had better environmental policies. We didn't even have to prove that we had mutually exclusive environmental policies. We just had to show that there currently was a broad trajectory towards better environmental policies in the future, which could achieve much of the benefits of the affirmative team, a trajectory that must exist by the premise of this motion to be even true in the first place. By contrast, the way we won this debate was pointing to a series of harms unique to this policy that outweighed the unique benefits of this policy. So let's start in harms. First question, how does this affect countries within and out of the EU economically? And I want to start this issue by explaining how winning this automatically wins the negative team the debate. The only counterweight we hear on this issue is second affirmative's weighing to suggest that climate change disproportionately affects people from the developing world, so it's the more important impact. The problem with this weighing is that it never explained why the producers in the developing world are also simultaneously the victims most affected by climate change. So this weighing was insufficient. By contrast, we gave you 3 weighing metrics unresponded to by this negative team. Firstly, we explained that the loss of revenue from exports was a certain harm, whereas the harms of climate change to the affirmative team's magnitude was speculative. Secondly, we explained that this was the unique harm of this was that this was a unique harm of a tax on imports. So out of all the set of environmental policies, this was the only one that had this deleterious effect. And thirdly, because we explained that this instrumentalized the most vulnerable actors in the debate. So even if climate change was a good outcome on net, it was not ever clear why we ought sacrifice the most poor and the most vulnerable in order to achieve that goal. So given that, if we win this issue in economics, we win the debate. And our claim very simply was that this harms the poor and developing nations who rely on exports and also harms the poor in the EU who rely on imports to pay for things like the cost of electricity. And the responses of the second team were simply insufficient. First, there was some tension between our argument on the cost of exports and cost of imports. No, clearly there wasn't. Obviously, some firms will still sell, but those will cost much greater. Some firms will not be able to sell, so that harms the people in the developing world. Secondly, their insane burden push suggests that our benefit only matters when entirety of firms go to the EU. We explained that is simply not true. We just explained that a sufficient majority and will leave, and that will capture much of our benefits. And lastly, just that the insane implausible characterization that countries in the developing world can just diversify instead, as if they wouldn't already have done that if they had the capital to do so. We explained that these were countries that uniquely relied upon their exports, and that was the very thing that meant that they would incur in economic harms. So that's why we win the first issue and win the debate. Secondly, how does this affect environmental policy? And I want to know just how many layers of generosity that we have contested the affirmative team on this issue, because we have explained that the bar to winning this issue is very low. We just have to explain that there were other policies that had the same symmetric benefits. We outweighed this issue. But lastly, we explain that this policy comes at the cost of future economic policies down the line. And let's note just how symmetric much of their supposedly unique benefits of this policy had. First, the fact that the EU has better regulation. We in fact showed that that was not a static benefit in this debate, but in fact was one that was actively repealed at the point at which you had more firms and more people actively calling for these regulations to be repealed. And that even if that was not true, it did not matter because firms had to overproduce and that incurred much of the harms. Secondly, the fact that this increased the incentive to innovate. We explained that in fact it depressed the incentive to innovate because you could rely on these cheaper imports instead. And that meant that due to the extent that you gave European countries an unfair competitive advantage, that in fact decreased the incentive to innovate because you provided a much more cheaper alternative. For those reasons, the negative team conclusively wants to debate.
I thank the negative reply for their fine speech. I would now like to welcome the affirmative reply to conclude this debate.
Threeann's big reason that developing world countries can't pivot is because that they have massive economies of scale with the other things that they need to produce, which is why you should buy it when affirmative says that, yeah, they have other places that they can export to, and why that mitigates one of the few unique harms they try to give you. I thought that that response was almost as good, i.e. bad, as when negative reply gets up and says, hey, you'd have already pivoted away from focusing on an industry that was otherwise profitable until this regulation was introduced in the future, which obviously was a bit of an logical error. I think that those types of claims, contradictory as they were indicative of the general strategic mover of a negative team who realizes that they're down to do a couple of things that weren't really strategic, a couple of things beyond trying to hang their hat on Whyte. The first of those was an attempt to recuperate from back half when they realized that their burden is to oppose the CBAM once political capital has been expended, once the uncontested analysis that we get most lucidly from Liv establishes and stands in this debate as to why you are unlikely to get a better alternative into the future, something that you should obviously weigh given the imperative that we told you about climate change. They couldn't try and run away with that in reply. They had to actually defeat it substantively. But I think that the more interesting sort of misstep that they make is with the environment. Because to get any of the truths that they tell you about how you're going to get local production, there was a few hurdles of incredulity that they actually just needed to trick an adjudication panel down. So I'm going to walk you down the merry garden path and tell you about these hurdles that they just think you won't see, that any logical reasoning panelist wouldn't stumble over. The first is necessary homogeneity and inflexibility all across the developing world in terms of how goods are created. So the ingredients that you can use from things, and how easy it is to pivot. Homogeneity in which countries do things in different ways in the status quo. The impossibility and the inflexibility of doing things in a more sustainable way. They needed to prove that to a large extent, as Negative Reply correctly notices, to convince you that a lot of companies were going to do the obviously more expensive thing of setting up in the EU with their much, much higher costs. But I think as well that they make a misstep when they just more or less assert in like the neg closing block that, they consider what happens if industries move to Europe, so they lose by implicit concession. That was called good debating. We were considering both worlds to show that whichever characterization you bought, we still won the debate. They hang their hat on one world, which is why if you didn't think it was the case that they all moved to Europe, they definitely lose, but we can still win if you did. But the other and next thing that you had to believe to buy any of their environmental benefits was that domestic production was going to happen for these companies. And you had to believe that despite the things that we tell you that often go unresponded to. And I think it actually is just a little bit evasive when Sierra says, look, we uniquely get a big source of levies and have it right now to invest in things like sustainable resources, to invest in things like softening the blow, when she whips what Liv tells you to unresponsively, what Liv tells you to that goes unresponded to. You had to ignore that, like side negative did, to believe their benefits here. You had to also ignore the examples that we give you of alternatives in terms of how you can just use different concrete mixtures, how you can use things like reusable bands. And you also have to agree with the asserted economic clash of like supply chains like this and supply chains like that. Both teams don't go into a huge amount of nitty-gritty depth, but that changes at Sierra when she tells you that there are real and there are like these real prices versus the inflated profit margins by not properly factoring into risk. And I get that Third Negative didn't want to talk about that, but that was a real reason why you should buy above that deadlock, that you could absorb the cost from companies that already were set up to import goods that would already continue to being able to. But let's say that you reach the end of that and you get these industries in town. What do we still tell you? The EU regulates better, that you shield nascent industries that can spread across the world and provide regulatory models, that you incentivize innovation and extraterritorial investment from the firms that best knew how, and that you uniquely used our subsidies to good, which is why, by being more comparative, we clearly take this debate.
Hey, thanks everyone. Good debate.
Thank you, everyone. If I'm able to, I'll pause the recording now, but good job, everyone. We'll just take some time to deliberate and get the results back to you soon. Fantastic debate.
Thanks for the debate, guys.
Cheers, guys.
All right. I'm going to pop to the bathroom and then also just take some time to submit ballots and decide, are we happy to have 5-6 minutes or longer if necessary?